Sony Music Studios, New York City, November 18, 1993. The world remembers Nirvana's MTV Unplugged performance as one of the most haunting concerts in rock history. Kurt Cobain sitting on that stool in his oversized cardigan and torn jeans, his voice fragile and beautiful, performing songs that felt less like entertainment and more like farewell. 50 million people would eventually watch that broadcast, and critics would call it transcendent, a perfect capture of grunge's raw emotional honesty. But 2 hours before the cameras started rolling, in a dressing room beneath the studio stage, Krist Novoselic discovered something that transformed his understanding of what that performance would mean. He found Kurt alone, practicing a song that wasn't on the setlist, a song Kurt had never played live before, singing lyrics that sounded more like a suicide note than a rock ballad. What Kurt told Krist in those next 8 minutes would never be discussed publicly until Krist finally broke his silence in a 2024 interview. And what happened during those 2 hours before the taping would explain why MTV Unplugged felt less like a concert and more like a memorial service for someone who was still alive. If you were part of the MTV generation in 1993, you understand the cultural weight of the Unplugged series. MTV had launched the acoustic concert format in 1989, inviting major artists to strip away the production and perform intimate versions of their hits with minimal amplification. The series had already featured everyone from Eric Clapton to Mariah Carey, proving that great songs could survive without the studio polish and electronic enhancement that dominated early 90s music. But Nirvana's participation carried special significance because grunge was supposed to be loud, aggressive, distorted, the antithesis of acoustic intimacy. Could Kurt Cobain's anguished howl translate to whispered vulnerability? Could songs built on feedback and fury work with clean guitars and cellos? MTV was betting millions of dollars and prime broadcast time that the answer was yes. Subscribe now to discover the hidden truths behind the performances that defined a generation. Kurt Cobain had resisted doing MTV Unplugged for months. The initial invitation had come in early 1993, shortly after the release of In Utero, Nirvana's deliberately uncommercial follow-up to Nevermind. MTV executives saw Unplugged as the perfect platform to showcase the album's more melodic moments, songs like All Apologies and Dumb that revealed Kurt's gift for melody beneath the noise. But Kurt was suspicious of MTV by 1993, blamed the network for contributing to Nirvana's mainstream success, for playing Smells Like Teen Spirit so relentlessly that the song had lost whatever rebellious meaning it originally carried. He'd given interviews criticizing MTV's role in commodifying alternative music, turning underground culture into marketable product for suburban teenagers. So when MTV came asking for an unplugged performance, Kurt's first response had been an emphatic no. What changed his mind was a combination of factors that Krist Novoselic would later describe as Kurt's contradictions catching up with him. Part of it was financial. Nirvana was successful but not wealthy by rock star standards, and MTV was offering a substantial fee plus guaranteed broadcast during prime time, exposure that would help In Utero sales, even if Kurt claimed not to care about commercial performance. Part of it was artistic challenge. Kurt had been experimenting with acoustic arrangements of Nirvana songs, wondering if the material could work in stripped-down versions that emphasized melody over aggression. And part of it, though Kurt would never admit this publicly, was the appeal of reinvention, the chance to show another side of himself beyond the angry grunge icon that media had constructed around him. So in October 1993, Kurt finally agreed to the taping, but with conditions. He wanted creative control over the setlist, didn't want to just play acoustic versions of radio hits. He wanted to include covers, songs by artists he genuinely admired, rather than just showcasing Nirvana material. He wanted the staging to be dark and intimate, candles and lilies, instead of typical MTV glitz. And he wanted rehearsal time to properly arrange songs that had never been designed for acoustic performance. MTV agreed to everything, partly because they were desperate to secure Nirvana for the series, partly because Kurt's demands actually aligned with the raw, authentic aesthetic that made Unplugged successful. The band arrived in New York on November 15th for 3 days of rehearsal before the November 18th taping. They'd rented a rehearsal space in Manhattan where they could work through arrangements away from the pressure of the actual MTV studio. Kurt had assembled an expanded lineup for the performance, bringing in second guitarist Pat Smear, who'd been touring with them, plus cellist Laurie Goldston and guitarist Krist Novoselic to fill out the sound. The rehearsals revealed immediately that this wasn't going to be a typical Nirvana performance. Kurt had chosen a setlist heavy on obscure covers and deep album cuts, songs that even hardcore fans might not recognize. He wanted to play The Man Who Sold the World, the David Bowie song from 1970 that most people knew from Bowie's later recording, but that Kurt loved in its original raw form. He wanted to perform 3 songs by the Meat Puppets, bringing the Kirkwood brothers from that band on stage to play with them. He wanted to close with Where Did You Sleep Last Night, the traditional folk song that Lead Belly had recorded in the 1940s, a song about murder and loss that had nothing to do with grunge or alternative rock. Krist Novoselic had known Kurt Cobain since 1985, when they were teenagers in Aberdeen, Washington, playing music in basements and dreaming about maybe someday getting a record deal with some tiny independent label. 8 years later, they'd achieved success beyond anything either of them had imagined, but Krist understood better than almost anyone how that success had damaged Kurt psychologically. The pressure, the expectations, the loss of privacy, the transformation from person into symbol, all of it had been slowly destroying the friend Krist remembered from those early days. So when rehearsals began for MTV Unplugged, Krist was already watching Kurt carefully, already worried about his state of mind, and whether this high-profile performance would help or hurt. What Krist noticed during those 3 days of rehearsal was how seriously Kurt was taking the material, how much emotional weight he was putting into songs that were supposed to be just an acoustic concert. Kurt's voice during Pennyroyal Tea carried a devastation that went beyond performance, beyond even the song's dark lyrics about self-medication and desperation. His interpretation of Something in the Way, the Nevermind album track about homelessness and isolation, sounded like someone singing their own epitaph. And when they rehearsed Where Did You Sleep Last Night, Kurt's voice on the final verse, where Lead Belly's original had escalated to a howl of anguish, made everyone in the rehearsal space fall silent, because it didn't sound like someone performing a traditional folk song. It sounded like someone losing their grip on sanity in real time. After the 3rd rehearsal on November 17th, Krist pulled Kurt aside and asked directly if he was okay, if maybe they should postpone the taping, if the pressure was too much. Kurt had brushed him off, said he was fine, said the intensity was just him getting into the material, said Krist was worrying too much like he always did. But Krist had seen the defensive anger flash in Kurt's eyes when questioned, had recognized that particular kind of fury that came from someone who knows they're barely holding themselves together and resents anyone noticing. So Krist had backed off, had told himself that maybe the performance would be cathartic, maybe giving Kurt a platform to channel all that darkness into art would help rather than hurt. It was the kind of rationalization that feels reasonable at the time, but looks increasingly like willful blindness in retrospect. November 18th arrived cold and grey, typical New York November weather that matched the somber mood Kurt had been cultivating for the performance. The taping was scheduled for 7 p.m., with the band due at Sony Music Studios by 4 p.m. for final sound check and preparation. The studio was located on West 54th Street in Manhattan, a state-of-the-art facility that MTV used regularly for unplugged tapings. The set had been dressed according to Kurt's specifications: dark curtains, minimal lighting, candles scattered across the stage, stargazer lilies in vases, an atmosphere more suited to a funeral than a rock concert. MTV's production team had initially questioned whether the aesthetic was too morbid, but Kurt had insisted, and by this point everyone had learned that arguing with Kurt Cobain about artistic decisions was futile. The band arrived at 4:15 and spent the next hour and a half running through final sound checks, adjusting monitor levels, making sure the acoustic instruments balanced properly with Nirvana's rhythm section. Kurt seemed focused and professional during sound check, working efficiently with the audio engineers, joking occasionally with Pat Smear about guitar tuning, drinking tea to soothe his throat before the performance. To most of the MTV crew and production staff, he appeared nervous but functional, the typical pre-show jitters of a major artist preparing for a broadcast that would reach millions of viewers. But Krist was watching more carefully, noticing small details that suggested Kurt's apparent calm was carefully constructed rather than genuine. At 5:45, with just over an hour before taping was scheduled to begin, Kurt disappeared. One moment he was on stage adjusting his guitar strap, the next he'd vanished backstage without telling anyone where he was going. This wasn't particularly unusual. Artists often needed privacy before performances, time to mentally prepare or physically warm up away from the crew and technical chaos, so nobody thought much of it when Kurt slipped away, assumed he'd gone to the dressing room or maybe outside for air. But after 15 minutes passed with no sign of Kurt, Krist started to worry. He knew Kurt's patterns, knew that disappearing for extended periods usually meant either drug use or emotional crisis, and either possibility was concerning given the high-stakes performance looming. Krist excused himself from the stage area and went looking for Kurt. The dressing rooms were located down a hallway behind the stage, 3 small rooms designated for band members and guests. Krist checked the main dressing room first, found it empty except for bags and guitar cases. He checked the bathroom, also empty. He was about to go back and ask MTV staff if anyone had seen Kurt leave the building when he heard it. Acoustic guitar, very quiet, coming from the 3rd dressing room at the end of the hallway, and singing, Kurt's voice unmistakable, even when barely above a whisper. Krist approached the dressing room door slowly, some instinct telling him that whatever was happening in that room was private and painful, and maybe not meant to be witnessed. The door was slightly ajar, enough that he could see inside without pushing it open. Kurt was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, acoustic guitar across his lap, playing a song that Krist didn't recognize. It wasn't on the Unplugged setlist they'd rehearsed. It wasn't a Nirvana song or a cover they'd discussed. It was something new, or at least something Kurt had never played for the band before. The melody was simple, just 3 chords repeating, the kind of basic progression that folk songs and children's lullabies use, because simplicity carries emotional weight that complexity often obscures. But the lyrics, even from the hallway, Krist could hear them clearly, and they made his blood run cold. Kurt was singing about being tired, about wanting to sleep and not wake up, about how everyone would be better off if he just disappeared, about Frances Bean growing up happier without a father who was too broken to be what she needed. The words were direct in a way that Kurt's published lyrics rarely were, stripped of the metaphor and abstraction that usually gave him deniability when people asked if his songs were autobiographical. Krist stood frozen in the hallway for perhaps 30 seconds, listening to Kurt sing this devastating song that sounded less like artistic expression and more like a suicide note set to music. Then he made the decision to interrupt rather than retreat, pushed the door open wider and said Kurt's name. Kurt's fingers stilled on the guitar strings. He looked up at Krist with eyes that were red, either from crying or from the substances he'd been using to manage his chronic pain and anxiety, probably both. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence heavy with everything they weren't saying, all the conversations they'd avoided having over the past 2 years, as Kurt's problems had escalated, and everyone around him had pretended things were manageable. "How long have you been standing there?" Kurt asked finally, his voice flat and tired. "Long enough," Krist said. "What are you doing, Kurt? What was that song?" Kurt looked down at the guitar, traced one finger along the fretboard like he was deciding whether to answer honestly or deflect with sarcasm and anger. "Just something I was working on," he said. "It's nothing, doesn't matter." "It doesn't sound like nothing," Krist said, stepping fully into the dressing room and closing the door behind him. "It sounds like, man, I'm worried about you. We're all worried about you. That song sounds like a suicide note." Kurt's laugh was bitter and humorless. "Maybe it is," he said. "Would that be so terrible? Everyone keeps acting like my life is so great, like I should be grateful for all this success, but they don't understand that success ruined everything. I can't write music anymore without thinking about how it'll be received, about whether it's commercial enough or too commercial, about what it means for the brand. I can't have a relationship with my wife without tabloids analyzing every fight. I can't be a father to my daughter without wondering if I'm destroying her by being who I am. So yeah, sometimes I think everyone would be better off if I just wasn't here anymore." The words hung in the small dressing room like poison gas, visible and toxic. Krist felt his heart hammering in his chest, felt the adrenaline spike that comes with recognizing genuine danger to someone you love. This wasn't the first time Kurt had expressed dark thoughts, wasn't even the first time he'd talked about suicide in Krist's presence. But something about the timing, about being an hour away from a major televised performance, about the calm matter-of-fact way Kurt was discussing his own death, made it different this time, more real, more imminent. "You can't do the show," Krist said. "We need to cancel. We need to get you to a hospital or a therapist or something, because what you just said is not okay, Kurt. That's not artistic darkness or depression talking. That's you telling me you're thinking about killing yourself, and I can't just ignore that and let you go perform for MTV like everything's fine." Kurt's expression shifted from flat exhaustion to something sharper, more focused. "You're not canceling anything," he said. "MTV has invested too much money. There are contracts. We'll get sued if we don't show up. And besides, I need to do this performance. I need to play these songs the way I've arranged them because..." He trailed off, looked away, seemed to be deciding how much to reveal. "Because why?" Krist pressed. "Because it's the last chance," Kurt said quietly. "The last chance to make something that matters, that's real, that isn't corrupted by commercial bullshit. These songs, this setlist, the way I want to perform them tonight, it's the closest I've come in 2 years to making actual art instead of product. So I'm going to do the show, and I'm going to put everything I have into it. And then after that..." He didn't finish the sentence, just let it hang incomplete and ominous. Krist wanted to argue, wanted to physically drag Kurt out of the building and force him into treatment, whether he wanted it or not. But he was trapped by practicality and by his own uncertainty about whether intervention would help or just push Kurt further into darkness. They were an hour from taping. Canceling now would create legal and financial chaos. And maybe Kurt was right, that performing, channeling all this pain into artistic expression, would provide some release or catharsis that might prevent worse outcomes later. Or maybe Krist was just rationalizing his own cowardice, his inability to force confrontation when confrontation might cost their friendship and the band. "Promise me something," Krist said finally. "Promise me that after the show, after we're done tonight, you'll talk to someone professional. Not me, not Courtney, someone trained to handle this stuff. Because I can't carry this alone, Kurt. What you just told me is too heavy." Kurt looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay," he said. "After the show I'll talk to someone, I promise." Whether he meant it or whether he was just saying what Krist needed to hear was impossible to determine. But Krist chose to believe him because the alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. At 7 p.m., the cameras started rolling on what would become one of the most celebrated concerts in rock history. The audience of approximately 200 people, mostly MTV contest winners and music industry insiders, sat in near darkness as Nirvana took the stage. Kurt looked exactly like he'd looked in the dressing room an hour earlier, the same oversized cardigan and torn jeans, the same blonde hair hanging in his face, the same hollow exhaustion in his eyes that the cameras would interpret as artistic intensity rather than genuine suffering. He sat on a stool center stage, acoustic guitar across his lap, and launched into About a Girl without preamble or introduction, his voice surprisingly strong and clear given how wrecked he'd sounded earlier. Krist stood stage left with his acoustic bass, watching Kurt throughout the performance with hypervigilance born from their earlier conversation. Every song felt weighted with additional meaning now that Krist understood what Kurt had been doing in that dressing room, what song he'd been practicing that wasn't on the official set list. When Kurt sang "Come As You Are" and reached the line about not having a gun, Krist felt physically ill, knowing that Kurt owned guns, knowing that statistics on suicide by firearm, knowing that depression plus access to weapons equals disaster. When they performed Dumb, a song Kurt had written about being simple and happy and not thinking too much, Krist heard it as confession rather than fiction, Kurt admitting that his intelligence and self-awareness were burdens rather than gifts. The covers Kurt had chosen took on darker resonance as well. The Man Who Sold the World wasn't just a David Bowie song anymore, it was Kurt questioning his own identity, wondering if success had transformed him into someone unrecognizable. The 3 Meat Puppets songs weren't just alt-country detours, they were Kurt trying to connect with earlier, purer forms of American music before everything became commercialized and corrupted. And Where Did You Sleep Last Night, the closing song that Kurt had insisted on despite MTV's preference for ending with something more recognizable, became a showcase for Kurt's vocal range and emotional intensity that left the studio audience sitting in stunned silence when it finished. That final performance of Where Did You Sleep Last Night would become legendary, the clip that got replayed constantly after Kurt's death, the moment that seemed to capture everything about his gift and his suffering. The song built slowly, Kurt's voice starting soft and controlled, gradually escalating through the verses until the final repetition where he pushed into a scream that sounded like someone being torn apart from the inside. His face during that final scream, captured in close-up by MTV's cameras, showed something beyond performance, beyond even emotion. It showed someone experiencing genuine anguish, channeling real pain into artistic expression in a way that was both transcendent and horrifying to witness. When the song ended and Kurt dropped his head, spent and shaking, the studio audience didn't immediately applaud. They sat in silence for several seconds, processing what they'd just witnessed, unsure whether applause was the appropriate response to something that felt more like witnessing a breakdown than a performance. Eventually, someone started clapping, and others joined in, but the applause felt inadequate, felt like trying to respond to genuine suffering with polite appreciation. The taping wrapped at approximately 8:30 p.m. MTV's producers were ecstatic, already planning the broadcast schedule and predicting the performance would be one of Unplugged's most successful episodes. Kurt's artistic gamble had paid off commercially, proving that Nirvana could work in an acoustic format, that their songs had structural integrity beyond just loud guitars and Dave Grohl's powerful drumming. But Krist wasn't thinking about commercial success or critical reception. He was thinking about what Kurt had told him in that dressing room 2 hours earlier, about the song that wasn't on the setlist, about the promise Kurt had made to talk to someone professional after the show. Backstage after the taping, Kurt seemed lighter, almost euphoric in a way that Krist found more concerning than his earlier despair. The performance had clearly provided some release, some satisfaction that came from executing a difficult artistic vision successfully. MTV staff congratulated him. Audience members who'd been invited backstage told him it was the most powerful thing they'd ever witnessed live. Pat Smear and the other musicians celebrated pulling off such a challenging set of arrangements. But Krist recognized the manic quality in Kurt's energy, understood that this euphoria was probably temporary, possibly chemically enhanced, certainly not evidence that the underlying problems had been resolved by one successful performance. Krist pulled Kurt aside before they left Sony Music Studios, reminded him about the promise to talk to someone professional. Kurt nodded, said he remembered, said he'd make calls when they got back to Seattle. But his eyes when he said it were distant, already moving past the promise to whatever came next, and Krist felt his stomach sink because he understood that Kurt was lying, or at least not taking the promise seriously. Still, what more could Krist do? He couldn't force an adult into treatment. He couldn't monitor Kurt 24 hours a day. He couldn't save someone who didn't want to be saved, or who was too deep in their own darkness to recognize they needed saving. MTV Unplugged in New York aired on December 16, 1993. About a month after the taping, the broadcast was immediately recognized as something special, generating massive viewership and critical praise. Reviews called it Nirvana's finest moment, Kurt Cobain's most mature and emotionally resonant performance, proof that grunge could transcend its loud, aggressive roots and access deeper artistic territory. The performance would eventually be released as a live album in November 1994, 7 months after Kurt's death, and would sell millions of copies worldwide, introducing whole new audiences to Nirvana through these stripped-down versions of their songs. But for those who knew Kurt personally, who'd been there at Sony Music Studios on November 18, 1993, the performance carried darker meanings that casual viewers missed. Krist Novoselic watched the broadcast alone in his Seattle home, and every song felt like a warning he'd failed to properly heed. Kurt's fragility, his obvious pain, the way certain lyrics seemed to be speaking directly about suicide and self-destruction, all of it was visible in the broadcast for anyone paying close attention. But most viewers interpreted the darkness as artistic intensity, as grunge's raw emotional honesty, not as genuine cries for help from someone who was already planning his exit. The detail that haunted Krist most was something that didn't make the final broadcast. During one of the breaks between songs, while technicians adjusted microphone positions, Kurt had looked directly at Krist across the stage and mouthed 3 words, "Thank you, brother." At the time, Krist had interpreted it as gratitude for decades of friendship, acknowledgement of their shared journey from Aberdeen nobodies to international success. But watching the broadcast a month later, seeing Kurt's expression when he'd mouthed those words, Krist realized it had been goodbye. "Thank you for everything, thank you for caring, thank you for trying, but I'm already gone in every way that matters, and nothing you do will change what's coming." Between the MTV Unplugged taping in November 1993 and Kurt's death in April 1994, Krist would have approximately 15 more conversations with Kurt, some about band business, some about personal matters, none of them as raw and honest as that moment in the dressing room before the performance. Kurt never followed through on the promise to talk to someone professional, or if he did, it wasn't effective enough to alter his trajectory. His drug use escalated, his relationship with Courtney became increasingly volatile, his chronic stomach pain worsened, or at least his complaints about it became more frequent and desperate. The European tour in early 1994 was a disaster, culminating in the Rome incident in March, where Kurt overdosed on champagne and Rohypnol in what may have been a suicide attempt, though the official story was accidental. Krist tried to maintain contact, tried to be available as friend and bandmate, but the distance between them was growing regardless of physical proximity. Kurt was withdrawing into himself, pushing away the people who cared about him, either because he didn't want them to witness his deterioration, or because he was already mentally preparing for an ending that he couldn't discuss with anyone who might try to prevent it. The last time Krist spoke to Kurt was in late March, a brief phone conversation about potential tour dates that neither of them really believed would happen. Kurt sounded tired and distant, going through the motions of planning a future he probably didn't expect to live to see. When the news came on April 8, 1994, that Kurt's body had been discovered in the greenhouse above his garage, dead from a self-inflicted shotgun wound, Krist wasn't surprised. Devastated, certainly. Destroyed by grief and guilt, and the thousand what-ifs that accompany any suicide. But not surprised, because he'd known since that conversation in the Sony Music Studios dressing room 5 months earlier that Kurt was moving toward this ending, and nothing Krist or anyone else had tried had been sufficient to change that trajectory. For 3 decades, Krist Novoselic barely discussed what happened in that dressing room 2 hours before MTV Unplugged. He gave interviews about Nirvana, participated in documentaries about Kurt, helped oversee the band's posthumous releases and legacy management. But he never revealed what Kurt had been doing when Krist found him, never disclosed the song that wasn't on the set list, never repeated what Kurt had said about suicide and everyone being better off without him. Part of this silence was respecting Kurt's privacy, protecting his friend's memory from becoming just another cautionary tale about rock star excess and mental illness. Part of it was protecting himself, avoiding the judgment that would inevitably come with admitting he'd known how serious Kurt's problems were and hadn't done more to intervene. But mostly, Krist said in the 2024 interview where he finally disclosed these details, he'd stayed silent because talking about it wouldn't change anything. Kurt Cobain was still dead. MTV Unplugged was still a masterpiece created by someone in unbearable pain. And the choices Krist had made that night, to let Kurt perform rather than force cancellation, to accept Kurt's promise to seek help rather than demanding immediate intervention, were still the choices he'd made regardless of how questionable they looked with hindsight. So Krist had carried the memory privately, had let it inform his own work on suicide prevention and mental health advocacy, had tried to honor Kurt's legacy by learning from the tragedy rather than just dwelling in guilt. Watching MTV Unplugged in New York today, with full knowledge of what happened 5 months after it was recorded, the performance takes on almost unbearable poignancy. Every song feels like farewell. Every vulnerable moment feels like Kurt showing us exactly who he was and what he was struggling with, giving us every possible warning that he was in crisis and needed help. The candles and lilies that seemed like atmospheric artistic choices now look like funeral decorations. The somber tone that felt like creative maturity now sounds like someone already halfway departed from life. And that final scream on "Where did you sleep last night?" that moment of complete emotional devastation captured on camera, now looks less like performance and more like the sound of someone being torn apart by forces they couldn't control or escape. The song Krist heard Kurt practicing in the dressing room, the song that wasn't on the official set list, was never recorded as far as anyone knows. Kurt never played it for the band, never mentioned it again after that night, took whatever it was to his grave. But Krist remembers fragments of the lyrics, and those fragments suggest a directness about suicide that Kurt's published work usually avoided. He was telling us, in that moment when he thought nobody was listening, exactly what was happening in his mind, and then he went on stage and performed for millions, channeling that same darkness into songs that audiences could interpret as artistic rather than autobiographical, giving us the truth disguised as performance. This is the story of what Krist Novoselic saw 2 hours before MTV Unplugged, what Kurt Cobain revealed in a moment of privacy that became one more missed warning in a life full of warnings nobody quite knew how to respond to. It doesn't explain everything about Kurt's death, or Nirvana's legacy, or what that performance means in rock history, but it adds another layer of understanding, another piece of the incomplete puzzle we've been assembling for 30 years, trying to make sense of how someone that talented and that loved could still feel so alone and desperate that death seemed like the only escape. The MTV Unplugged performance remains a masterpiece, perhaps Nirvana's greatest artistic achievement, proof that their music transcended genre and format and could access emotional depths that most rock bands never approach. But it's also a document of suffering, captured on camera for posterity, a man showing us his wounds while we applauded the beauty of his pain. Krist Novoselic has to live with knowing he saw the warning that night in the dressing room, understood how serious the danger was, and still let Kurt take that stage because cancelling seemed impossible and performing seemed therapeutic, and nobody really believed that someone that successful and famous and talented could actually go through with killing themselves. But they can, they do. And 30 years later, we're still watching that unplugged performance, still trying to understand what Kurt Cobain was telling us through those songs, still wondering if there was some moment where intervention might have worked, some choice that could have led to a different ending. Krist knows there probably wasn't, knows that Kurt's problems were too deep and too complex to be solved by any single conversation or forced treatment or caring friend refusing to let him perform. But knowing doesn't eliminate the guilt, doesn't stop the midnight replays of that dressing room conversation, doesn't answer the question that haunts every survivor of someone else's suicide: could I have done more? The answer is always yes and always no, simultaneously true and inadequate, offering neither comfort nor resolution. Just the endless burden of memory and the knowledge that sometimes loving someone isn't enough to save them, sometimes seeing the warning isn't enough to prevent disaster, sometimes the best performance someone ever gives is also a farewell they're too polite to explicitly announce. This is what Krist Novoselic learned on November 18, 1993, in a dressing room beneath a stage in New York City, watching his oldest friend prepare to give the performance of his life while quietly planning his death. And it's the truth he's carried alone for 30 years, until finally breaking silence to tell us what we should have known all along, that MTV Unplugged wasn't just a concert. It was a memorial service for someone who was still breathing, still playing, still giving us everything he had before the darkness finally won.